I went camping with my parents and my brother's family. After a short walk with my 10-year-old daughter, everything was gone: the people, the tents, the food, the cars, no cell service, just a note on the table: this is for the best. Trust me, they left us to die in the forest. 10 days later, they regretted it. My name's Cara Whitfield. I'm 36 years old. It had been 6 months since Mark, my husband, died, and the silence in our house was still a physical weight, pressing down on the furniture and settling in the corners of every room. My daughter, Sophie, who was 10, had started drawing our family as just two stick figures, a big one and a small one, holding hands under a fiercely scribbled sun. Each drawing was a tiny, heartbreaking confirmation of our new reality. Mom insisted we needed to get away from it all. She called it a back-to-basics camping trip. No phones, no laptops, just family. She said it would be good for Sophie, but her eyes, full of a strange, pitying concern, were always on me. She'd been talking about my business, Copper Lark Coffee, as if it were a fragile thing I couldn't possibly handle alone anymore, a burden that was surely crushing me. My brother Colin and his wife Brittany, a woman who always looked perfectly polished even in casual clothes, agreed instantly. Brittany promised to pack artisanal marshmallows, the fancy kind with swirls of chocolate. Colin talked about teaching Sophie how to fish, casually stepping into the space Mark was supposed to occupy, filling a void I hadn't asked him to. I agreed because it was easier than arguing, and maybe a tiny part of me hoped they were right. I packed a small silver locket Mark gave me on our 5th anniversary. It was cool and smooth against my palm, a perfect weight. Inside, there was a tiny photo of him on one side, his smile effortless and warm, and one of Sophie and me on the other. It was my anchor. I also packed a waterproof survival kit, a habit from years of hiking with Mark. It was a small pouch with a lighter, a multi-tool, and a foil blanket. Colin laughed when he saw it. Overkill, Cara. We're right here with you. Nothing's going to happen. The campsite was beautiful, right by a deep blue lake surrounded by pine trees that smelled like clean air and memory. The water was so still it perfectly mirrored the bruised purple of the twilight sky. For a few hours, it actually worked. The trip, the healing, all of it. Sophie laughed, her face sticky with a marshmallow Brittany had toasted to a perfect golden brown over the fire. My dad, Greg, got a small, efficient fire going. The steady crackle of the wood was a comforting sound, a rhythm from my own childhood camping trips, a time when the world felt simple and safe. Mom kept fussing over me, a constant hum of attention. She'd fluff my pillow, tell me I looked tired, and suggest I let Colin handle lifting the heavy cooler. It felt less like care and more like an assessment, like she was cataloging my weaknesses. Colin draped a heavy arm over my shoulder as we watched the flames. "We've got you," he said, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. "Always." Brittany watched us from her camp chair, her smile tight and unreadable. She was sipping wine from a metal tumbler, careful not to get any dirt on her expensive hiking boots. She never liked getting her hands dirty. We told stories around the fire. I told Sophie about how Mark and I had camped at this very lake on our 1st anniversary, how he'd tried to cook a fish he'd caught and ended up setting a dish towel on fire. The memory brought a real smile to my face, not the sad, papery version I usually wore. It felt good to talk about him, to let his name exist in the open air. As I tucked Sophie into her sleeping bag inside our tent, the canvas smelling of nylon and cool night air, she whispered, "It's nice to have everyone here." Her words hit me with a surprising warmth. It did feel true just for that moment, a borrowed peace. The next morning, I promised Sophie a hike to the ridge to see the sunrise. It was our thing, a small tradition we'd started after Mark was gone, a way to prove to ourselves that the world kept turning and could still be beautiful. The air was cold and crisp, stinging my cheeks and making our breath puff out in white clouds. We held hands, her small, warm fingers wrapped tightly in mine. We didn't talk much, just listened to the crunch of our boots on the trail and the early morning chirps of the birds. The sunrise was spectacular. Streaks of fiery orange and soft pink painted the sky, spreading across the horizon and shimmering on the surface of the lake below. It was the first time in months I'd felt a flicker of real, uncomplicated hope, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, we were going to be okay. We sat on a flat rock, sharing the last of a granola bar, and watched the day begin. We were gone for maybe an hour. We came back down the trail, laughing about a fat, bold chipmunk that had tried to steal the granola bar wrapper right out of Sophie's pocket. Her laughter was light and free, and it felt like a gift. And then we stepped out of the tree line and into the main clearing of the campsite. Silence, the wrong kind of silence. Not the peaceful quiet of the forest, but a hollow, empty silence that screamed of absence. The tents were gone, the cars were gone, the campfire was a cold, black circle of ash. All of it, my parents, Colin, Brittany, our gear, our food, our shelter, had simply vanished. It was as if they had been erased from the world, leaving behind only flattened patches of grass and the faint, lingering smell of wood smoke. On the rough, weathered wood of the picnic table where we had all shared a meal just hours before, there was a single piece of white paper held down by a gray, smooth rock. I picked up the note. My fingers were trembling, numb with cold and a sudden, sickening dread. The handwriting was Colin's, that familiar, messy, left-leaning script I'd known my whole life. 5 words. "This is for the best, trust me." The words didn't make any sense. They floated in my mind, disconnected from reality. This had to be a prank, a cruel, impossible joke that wasn't funny. My throat felt tight and a sound clawed its way out. I screamed their names, Mom, Dad, Colin, and my voice echoed back at me, thin and useless against the vast, indifferent trees. Sophie's face crumpled, her big brown eyes filling with tears. "Where did Grandma go?" she whispered, her voice a tiny, fragile thing. I looked at the empty space where our car had been parked just that morning. The deep tire tracks in the soft dirt were the only proof they were ever here at all. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. An emergency, an accident, but they would have taken us. They wouldn't have packed up the tents. They wouldn't have left a note like this, a note without an explanation. The phrase, "trust me," rang in my head, a discordant bell. He'd said it so many times over the years, usually right before asking for a loan to cover a bad investment or trying to explain away some irresponsible mistake. It was his go-to phrase for getting what he wanted. I folded the note carefully, the creases sharp and deliberate, and tucked it into the front pocket of my jeans. Evidence. The thought came out of nowhere, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. My brain, in its panic, had latched onto a word that had no place in a family emergency. Panic was a high-pitched scream building in my ears. I felt my vision start to tunnel, the green of the trees blurring at the edges. But then I looked down at Sophie, who was watching me, her small face a mask of terror. Her fear was a bucket of ice water shocking me back into focus. My first job wasn't figuring this out. My first job was her, not them, her. I took a deep, shuddering breath and forced the air out slowly. "Okay," I said, my voice shaking so badly I barely recognized it. "Looks like we're on an adventure." The lie tasted like ash in my mouth. I checked our pockets, a frantic inventory of our world. We had 2 protein bars, a half-full bottle of water, the silver locket around my neck, and in my hiking pants, my small survival kit. That little pouch Colin had laughed at. The kit was a godsend. It had a lighter, a small but sharp knife, a compass, and a foil emergency blanket. His overkill was now our lifeline. I pulled out the compass, its little red needle quivering. The main road was west, but that was miles of dense, uphill forest. The stream we'd camped near flowed south downhill toward the lowlands where trails and roads were more likely. Downhill was easier, water was life, we'd follow the stream. I knelt down to Sophie's level, forcing a calm I didn't feel into my voice. "We're going to follow this little river, Sophie Bean. It'll lead us to a trail and we'll find some help." She just nodded, her face pale and streaked with dirt. She trusted me. The thought was both a comfort and a crushing, unbearable weight. The first day was a blur of walking. The forest was thicker than it looked, and the stream bank was a treacherous mix of slick mud and tangled roots. Every step was a calculation. We held hands, my grip tight on her, terrified she'd slip and fall. By noon, the sun was high and hot, and I knew we had to eat. We sat on a fallen log, and I carefully unwrapped the first protein bar. I broke it in half, giving her the slightly larger piece. It tasted like cardboard and sawdust, a dry, gritty paste, but it was fuel. It was something. Sophie's stomach growled loudly that afternoon, a sad, rumbling sound that echoed in the quiet woods. I tried to distract her, pointing out a bright blue jay, showing her the lacy patterns on a fern. My own hunger was a dull, constant ache behind my ribs, a physical reminder of how little we had, how far we had to go, and how utterly alone we were. We refilled our water bottle from the stream, the clear water looking deceptively clean. I knew it was a risk, drinking it without boiling it first, but we had no choice. That night, we huddled together under the thin foil blanket. It crinkled with every tiny movement, a constant, metallic whisper. The ground was cold and hard, leaching the warmth from our bodies. Every snap of a twig in the darkness, every distant hoot of an owl made my heart leap into my throat. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, watching the slow rise and fall of Sophie's small form, her breath a faint mist in the chilly air. I kept thinking about them, my family, sitting in a warm car, stopping at a diner for dinner. Did they even think of us, or were we already a problem they had solved? The note said, "Trust me." It felt like a curse. By day 3, the world had shrunk to the next step, the next sip of water, the next sunrise. We learned to read the woods not for beauty but for survival. The bright, almost neon green of moss meant water was close. The rustle in the undergrowth was a squirrel, not a bear. The world of conference calls and quarterly reports felt like a dream I'd once had. I found a patch of huckleberries, a cluster of dark purple jewels hiding in the shade of a large bush. I remembered Mark pointing them out on a hike once, showing me the distinct shape of their leaves, telling me how to know they were safe. We feasted on them, stuffing them into our mouths by the handful. The sweet, tangy juice was a burst of life on our tongues, the first real flavor we'd had in days. For a few minutes, we were just a mother and daughter picking berries. My brain started to work differently. I wasn't Cara Whitfield, Chief Executive Officer of Copper Lark Coffee. I was a mother animal, and my only purpose on this earth was protecting my cub. I taught Sophie how to walk quietly, placing her feet carefully to avoid snapping twigs. I showed her how to watch for animal tracks in the soft mud by the stream. She was a trooper. She rarely complained, but I saw the exhaustion etched in the pale skin around her eyes, the slight drag in her steps. The hunger was a constant companion now, a hollow ache that never went away. It sharpened my senses. I could smell the damp earth, the sour, composting scent of rotting leaves, the faint, clean perfume of pine resin. I felt like I was becoming part of the forest, and the farther we walked away from that empty campsite, the farther away the other world seemed, the world with cars and houses and families who didn't leave you to die. On the 5th day, Sophie woke up shivering, but the morning air wasn't cold. I pressed my hand to her forehead. She was burning up. The stream water, it had to be. A new kind of fear, colder and sharper than hunger or the fear of being lost, pierced through me. Hunger I could manage, a storm I could find shelter from, but I couldn't fight a fever raging inside my daughter's small body. Her eyes were glassy and unfocused, and she was mumbling, her words slurring together. She was talking about Mark, asking if he was coming to get us soon. My composure, so carefully constructed over the past few days, finally cracked. I held her tight against my chest and cried for the first time, silent, hot tears tracking through the layers of grime on my face. She was all I had left, and I was losing her. Then, through the fog of my panic, another memory of Mark surfaced. He'd been an amateur botanist, always pointing out different plants on our hikes. He'd once tapped the trunk of a willow tree. Poor man's aspirin, he'd called the bark, explaining how it had the same natural compounds. I looked around wildly, my eyes scanning the trees lining the stream, and there it was. A white willow, its long, thin branches drooping gracefully toward the water. I gently laid Sophie down and used my small knife to strip off some of the inner bark. It was pale and fibrous. I didn't know how to prepare it, so I did the only thing I could think of. I chewed it myself, grinding it into a bitter, woody pulp. I coaxed Sophie to swallow it, a tiny bit at a time. She whimpered at the awful taste, but she did it. All I could do was hold her and pray that Mark was right. That afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, ugly purple. The wind began to whip through the trees with a low, mournful moan that sounded like a warning. The temperature dropped suddenly, the air growing heavy and cold. We needed shelter, and we needed it fast. I spotted a shallow overhang beneath a cluster of large boulders. It wasn't a cave, more like a deep scoop out of the earth, but it was enough to shield us from the worst of what was coming. I half-carried, half-dragged Sophie into the small space and used the foil emergency blanket to create a makeshift curtain over the opening, weighing the edges down with rocks. The storm broke with a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath us. Rain came down in solid, blinding sheets, turning the world outside our little shelter into a gray, blurry mess. The wind howled, a furious, shrieking sound, and I could hear the groan and crack of trees nearby. I knew one falling branch could end us both. I wrapped my arms and my entire body around Sophie, who was shaking uncontrollably with fever and fear. I started humming. It was the lullaby I'd sung to her every night since she was a baby, a simple, repetitive tune. I hummed through my own chattering teeth, trying to make my body a shield, a barrier of warmth against the cold and the terrifying sound. It felt like the whole world was trying to erase us, just like my family had. I just held on tighter, humming into the darkness. The storm lasted for 2 days. We huddled in our little rock shelter, the world a constant roar of wind and rain. On the morning of the 8th day, the rain finally stopped. The world outside was dripping and broken, with fallen branches and torn leaves everywhere. But Sophie's fever had broken. The willow bark, Mark's gift from the past, had worked. She was weak and pale, but her eyes were clear when she looked at me. We were out of food. The huckleberry patch was long behind us. We were weak, running on nothing but desperation and adrenaline. We couldn't walk much farther. I knew we had one last chance. We couldn't walk to help, so help had to come to us. We needed a signal. I found a small clearing on a rise, a patch of ground that might be visible from the air. I gathered every damp branch and pile of wet leaves I could find, my muscles screaming in protest. My hands were raw and trembling as I tried to get the fire started. The lighter sparked again and again, the tiny flame refusing to catch on the damp tinder I'd painstakingly collected. It was agony. Each failed spark felt like a final defeat. Finally, a tiny, stubborn flame caught on a piece of dry bark I'd sheltered in my pocket. I nurtured it like a newborn, blowing gently, feeding it the driest twigs I could find. When it was strong enough, I started piling on the wet leaves and damp wood. A thick, white column of smoke began to billow up, staining the gray sky. It was a prayer made of smoke, a desperate scream for help sent up to the heavens. I took Sophie's hand and we stood there, watching it rise. Using the last of my strength, I arranged rocks on the ground into a giant H for help, H for hope, H for here, we are here. We stayed by that fire for 2 more days, keeping the smoke going. It was our entire world, a small circle of warmth and hope in a vast, uncaring wilderness. I fed it constantly, my body moving on autopilot. On the 10th day, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic chopping sound, a noise that didn't belong to the forest. I grabbed Sophie's arm, my heart suddenly pounding against my ribs. Do you hear that? It grew louder, a steady thrumming that was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. A helicopter. It appeared over the ridge, a black speck against the white clouds. I started screaming, waving my arms like a madwoman, tears streaming down my face. Sophie was waving too, a small, frantic motion. The sound of the blades beat like a second heartbeat. It banked, circling our smoky H. They'd seen us, they'd seen us. A rescuer was lowered on a winch, a figure in a clean uniform descending from the sky. It was like seeing an angel. He unstrapped himself and ran to us as soon as his feet touched the ground. "Are you injured?" he shouted over the roar of the helicopter. I just shook my head, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. I was crying too hard. I held up Sophie, my daughter, I managed to choke out. She was sick. He wrapped us both in thick wool blankets that smelled impossibly clean, like laundry detergent and safety. As we were lifted into the sky, the ground falling away beneath us, I looked down at the vast green wilderness that had almost claimed us. I had beaten it. We had survived. I had won. The world came back in a rush of noise and overwhelming light. The sterile white of hospital corridors, the insistent beeping of machines, the clean, antiseptic smell that was the opposite of the damp earth I'd grown used to. They put us in a shared room. Sophie was asleep in the bed next to mine, a clear IV drip taped to her tiny arm. The doctors, kind-faced men and women in scrubs, said she was severely dehydrated and malnourished, but that she would be fine. She would be fine. The words were a balm on my raw soul. I had cuts, bruises, and had lost 15 pounds I couldn't afford to lose, but I was alive. We were both alive. I lay in the stiff, scratchy sheets and waited. I expected to see my parents. I expected them to burst through the door at any moment, their faces etched with worry and relief, ready to explain the terrible, awful misunderstanding. Hours passed. Nurses came and went, checking our vitals. A social worker, a gentle woman named Mrs. Gable, asked quiet questions I didn't have the energy to answer, but my family never came. A part of me, the part that had grown up trusting them, still tried to make excuses. Maybe they didn't know we'd been found yet. Maybe they were in their own hospital room somewhere, injured from the emergency that had forced them to leave. The hope was a flickering candle in a hurricane, and it was about to be extinguished. A police officer stood by my door for a while, then was replaced by a man in a dark suit. He had a kind but serious face that told me he wasn't there to celebrate our rescue. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, stepping into the room, "I'm Agent Lucas Reed with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI." The words didn't compute. I thought he was here about our rescue, maybe to get an official statement. I was so naive. Agent Reed, the man from the FBI, sat in the uncomfortable vinyl chair by my bed. "I know this is a difficult time, Mrs. Whitfield," he began, his voice calm and even, "but I need to ask you some questions about the morning you went missing." I told him everything. The beautiful sunrise, the hike with Sophie, coming back to the completely empty campsite. My voice was hoarse, but I pushed through, needing someone to understand the insanity of it. I reached for the locket around my neck. My fingers fumbled with the clasp. Inside, tucked behind the photo of Mark, was the note. It was crumpled and slightly damp, but the words were still clear. I handed it to him. He looked at the note, his expression completely unreadable. "Your brother, Colin Whitfield, filed a missing persons report 2 days after you were gone," he said. 2 days, the words hit me like a physical blow. They waited 2 days to tell anyone we were gone. Why? "He presented this same note to the local police," Agent Reed continued, tapping the paper. "Only he claimed that you wrote it." The air left my lungs in a silent whoosh, the room tilted. "What?" I whispered. "He suggested you were despondent over your husband's death. He told them he was worried you had run away and that you'd taken your daughter with you." The healing trip wasn't for healing, it was a stage. They were building a story and I was the tragic main character. I thought of Mom's constant comments about me being tired, about the business being too much of a burden. It wasn't concern, it was theater. They were laying the groundwork, planting the seeds of my supposed instability for anyone who would listen. Every worried glance, every over-the-top offer of help, it was all part of the act. Agent Reed wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady and serious. "Mrs. Whitfield, 5 days ago your brother, using that note as evidence of your unstable state of mind, filed a petition with the court to have you declared legally dead on an emergency basis." Legally dead. The words were clinical, absurd. I was sitting right in front of him, breathing, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. How could I be legally dead? "He also initiated a claim on your life insurance policy," Agent Reed said. For $1.5 million. The number just hung there in the sterile air of the hospital room. $1.5 million, that was my price. That's what my daughter and I were worth to them. 10 days of hell, a sick child, the constant terror, all for money. There's more, he said, his voice softening with something that might have been pity. He produced a will, supposedly signed by you 2 weeks ago. It names him the sole executor of your estate and gives him controlling interest of your company, Copper Lark Coffee. The fake will, the insurance claim, the carefully crafted story about my depression. It wasn't a panicked reaction or a mistake. It was a plan, meticulous, cruel, and calculated down to the last detail. The memory of Colin's heavy arm around my shoulders by the campfire, his voice saying, "We've got you," turned to poison in my mind. He hadn't been comforting me, he'd been saying goodbye. I looked over at Sophie, sleeping peacefully in her hospital bed, an innocent victim in a plot she couldn't possibly comprehend. They hadn't just left us to die. They had left us to die for money. The grief I felt for the family I thought I had, the family I loved, was suddenly cauterized, burned away by something else. Something cold, hard, and sharp as ice began to form in its place. After Agent Reed left, I sat in the silent, humming hospital room for a long time, just staring at the wall. The person who went into those woods was gone. The woman who believed in the fundamental goodness of her family, who made excuses for her brother's lifelong irresponsibility, who trusted her parents' cloying concern, she died out there, somewhere between the huckleberry patch and the willow tree. The woman who came back was different, colder, clearer. There was no room for tears. Crying felt like a luxury I couldn't afford, an indulgence I no longer had time for. My grief was a solid block of ice in my chest, and it wasn't melting. I thought about Sophie, shivering with fever in my arms in that dark, rocky shelter. I thought about the bitter taste of willow bark and the desperate, choking smell of wet smoke. They didn't just try to steal my money or my company, they tried to steal my daughter's future. They tried to steal her mother from her. The raw survival instinct that had kicked in on that mountain didn't turn off when the helicopter lifted me into the sky. It just changed its focus. My new wilderness wasn't made of trees and rocks. It was made of lies, legal documents, and a betrayal so profound it felt bottomless. But the goal was exactly the same: protect my child. I picked up the hospital phone, the plastic cool against my ear, and dialed the number Agent Reed had left me. It belonged to the best corporate lawyer in the state. When a calm voice answered, I said, "I need to hire Sam Ortiz." Sam Ortiz, my new attorney, was not what I expected. She was a short, sharp woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense haircut that looked like it meant business and intelligent eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She came to the hospital the very next day. She didn't offer pity or platitudes. She didn't tell me it was going to be okay. She offered a pen and a yellow legal pad. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice crisp and direct. "Start with the marshmallows." And so I did. I walked her through it all, my voice flat and emotionless, a simple recitation of facts. The setup of the healing trip, the abandonment, the note, the 10 days of survival, and the devastating revelations from the FBI. She listened, her pen flying across the page, filling it with tight, neat script. She only interrupted to ask clarifying questions that I hadn't even thought of. What time exactly was the sunrise? Who packed the food for the trip? Did Brittany say anything specific to you about the company before you left? When I finally finished, the whole ugly story laid out between us, she tapped her pen on the pad for a long moment. "They were sloppy," she said, a small, grim smile touching her lips. "Greedy people always are. They think they're smarter than everyone else, so they cut corners." She explained the legal path forward. It wouldn't just be one fight, but two. There would be a criminal case led by a prosecutor for the fraud, the endangerment, the attempted murder. And there would be a civil case, which was her territory, to recover my assets and wrestle back control of my company. "The most important thing," she said, looking me straight in the eye, her gaze unwavering, "is that you are the victim, but you cannot act like one. From now on, you are the architect of their downfall. You are the evidence. Your story, told clearly and without emotion, is the weapon. It was the first time I felt like I had any power since I'd read that cursed note. She hadn't given me sympathy, she'd given me a battle plan. Sam laid out the strategy right there in my hospital room. We wouldn't talk to the press. No tearful television interviews, no dramatic articles in the local paper. They want you to be the grieving, unstable widow, she said, her voice sharp. Because that story serves their purpose, we will show them the competent, meticulous chief executive officer. We will bury them in a clean, undeniable trail of their own actions and their own words. My goal was no longer just survival. It was to dismantle their story piece by piece, lie by lie, until nothing was left but the ugly, undeniable truth. I made a choice in that moment. I would not be defined by what they did to me in those woods. I would be defined by what I did next. My first task was to secure my company. Sam immediately got to work, and within hours she had arranged for a judge to sign a temporary injunction, an order that froze all of Copper Lark's accounts and prevented Colin from making any more decisions or moving any more money. Next, I called my second-in-command, Megan Chu, a regional manager I trusted completely. I told her a simplified, bare-bones version of the story. Her sharp, horrified gasp on the other end of the line was all the confirmation I needed. She didn't question it for a second. "What do you need, Kara?" she asked, her voice already shifting into a practical, determined tone. "I need you to be my eyes and ears," I said. "I need you to go into the office and find out everything Colin and Brittany have touched, every file they've opened, every call they've made." The risk was huge. This would be a war, and wars are messy. It would be ugly and public. It would force Sophie to relive the trauma in ways I couldn't yet imagine. But the alternative, letting them get away with it, letting them win, was unthinkable. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about consequence. The injunction hit them like a thrown stone, and it splashed all the way back to me in the form of a phone call. Dad's number lit up my screen the day the judge signed the order. I let it ring twice longer than I should have, letting the sound build into something I could control. When I answered, his voice came through loud and thin, like he'd been practicing a line. "Kara, what in God's name is this?" he said, 50% bluster and 50% wounded performative shock. "We were worried sick. You just run off and then you sue your own brother." He didn't ask if Sophie and I were okay. He didn't ask if I needed anything. He launched into the script I'd begun to recognize, the hurt voice, the accusation that I was overreacting. My throat tightened. For a second, I wanted him to be the man who'd taught me how to tie a fishing hook, not the one who'd left us to die. "You left us on a mountain, Dad," I said, and I kept my voice steady because Sam had told me to never let them pull me into a fight that sounded like emotion. "It was a mistake," he said. "Colin got a call. Brittany's mother had an emergency. We had to rush out. We thought you'd taken the other car." The lie was so clumsy the grass outside my window seemed to stiffen. "There was no other car," I said flatly, "and you left a note." "Colin's handwriting?" I could feel my hand balling into a fist at my side. I pictured the rock holding down that piece of paper on the picnic table, sunlight catching the bent corners. There was a pause on his end, a soft rustle, maybe him gripping the phone too hard. "That was to let you know we'd be back," he said finally, the voice a little smaller. "You're twisting things. You've been under so much stress, Kara. You're not thinking straight." He was trying to turn my logic against me. It was a move I'd seen before, call me irrational first so anyone listening would take his version. I could almost hear Brittany coaching from the passenger seat of whatever car they'd driven to their lies. "Tell your story to the investigators," I said. "Say everything you just told me." He stammered, then tried to put on an apology. I didn't need it. I needed the truth, and he was offering me theater. We hung up. My hand shook so badly I had to sit down. The phone felt foreign and hot in my palm. He'd called not to comfort us, not to say sorry, but to gaslight. That was their first countermove, spin a tale of my instability and hope no one checked the timestamps, the camera footage, the receipts. They wanted me to sound unhinged before we had a chance to show what we had. Within hours, the whispers started. It was subtle at first, an awkward pause at a staff meeting, a sympathetic email from someone I barely knew, but Brittany was the one who turned that whisper into a low, steady hum. She didn't call me, she didn't need to, she worked through other people's mouths. Brittany painted me as the tragic, unsteady widow. She was clever, she didn't accuse me of something people would immediately defend. She planted tiny, believable things. A comment here about me missing a meeting, a condolence that sounded like concern but suggested I was fragile. She seeded conversations with mutual acquaintances, mentioning in passing that I'd been forgetful lately and not sleeping. It was a slow drip, enough to make people look at me differently without needing concrete evidence. Her version of events wasn't built to fool everyone, it just needed to make a reasonable doubt. People who'd never been close to me started to ask in quiet tones if I was handling things. Vendors called to ask if someone else was taking over. A few longtime friends sent condolences that felt rehearsed. It was as if someone had lit a candle next to my name and watched the smoke for signs. Megan started forwarding me emails she found on our internal server, requests for new passwords, vendor access changes, attempts to set up emergency transfers labeled operational needs. Brittany wasn't subtle. She tried to lock the company into her narrative and then into her control. She made moves to put herself in a caretaker role, to be the one stabilizing Copperlark Coffee while I was allegedly spiraling. It was a two-pronged attack: make me seem incompetent and then position her as the only adult in the room. The cruelty of it wasn't just the lie, it was the way she used my grief like a weapon. She took the most human parts of me, my exhaustion, my need for help, and turned them into proof I couldn't lead. It was designed to make any accusation I made look like the desperate lashing of a broken person. Then Mom called Dr. Evans. I had moved heaven and earth to get Sophie into a therapist as soon as the hospital released us. Dr. Evans was gentle and steady, someone who made Sophie feel safe. For a few weeks, that room was a place where the kid could be a kid again, draw pictures with crayons, tell stories without flinching at the word grandma. After our third session, Dr. Evans called me. Her voice was careful. "Kara, I received a call from your mom. She's concerned about your mental state and its effect on Sophie." I felt my stomach drop like I'd been punched. "What did she say?" "She said she feared you might be delusional, that your grief is impairing your judgment, and she suggested I notify Child Protective Services if things don't improve." That last sentence cut through me in a way nothing else had. Mom wasn't pleading for help, she was weaponizing my daughter. The logic was brutal and simple: if you can make the system doubt me as a parent, you can silence me. Sam told me to expect it. She wasn't gentle about how people like my mother use institutions to hurt, but knowing it in theory and hearing it in a calm therapist's voice were two different things. I had to scramble. I gathered affidavits from Sophie's teacher, from our pediatrician, from neighbors who'd seen us together. I sat through interviews and filled out forms I never wanted to see. I had to prove my fitness as a mother while simultaneously trying to prove my family tried to kill us. It cost time, it cost my peace, and it cost Sophie a safe place to process what she'd been through. Dr. Evans had to step back, obligated by the fear sown by Mom. For a week we had no sessions. A week is small in the life of a trial, but in those early days it felt like a chasm. I lost a resource I had counted on. I lost the fragile normalcy that room had offered Sophie. And more than that, I lost the last scrap of faith that Mom would choose me and my child over a polished condo promised by Brittany. We lost a week of momentum. In legal fights, momentum carved the path forward. In life, momentum mattered even more. I felt the drain of having to defend the very fact that I loved my daughter, and every exhausted, paranoid night I lay awake thinking that proving love could be reduced to signatures and papers made me angrier than any courtroom later did. The notary was the one I thought of like a loose tooth. I knew he had to be wrenched out before the rest could settle. Sam said the fake will was their keystone. Take that away and the whole arch collapses. I remember the meeting with Agent Reed and Sam like it played in slow motion. The air-conditioned smallness of the room, the hum of the overhead light, the nervous little ticks of a man who clearly regretted his choices. Peter Lang ran a notary office above a laundromat, a place that smelled faintly of detergent and old pennies. He looked like someone who'd never had anyone demand answers of him before: greasy hair, a shirt with a faint coffee stain, hands that wouldn't stop rubbing together. He tried the first line every guilty man tries: "I did my job, she came in, she signed." Reed slid a printout across the table. "Do you recognize this?" he asked. It was security footage from the lobby of the building where Peter claimed I'd signed. There wasn't me. There wasn't anyone who looked like me. There was, however, a shot of Peter sitting at a cafe table 3 blocks away, across from Colin. Reed had the time stamped to the minute. I sat very still. My fingers tapped the edge of my folder, the sound loud in the small room. Peter's face, which had tried to look solid, crumpled like wet paper. He fumbled with his words, then started to spill out a story that wasn't elegant but was devastating in its simplicity. Colin had come to him, he said, with a stack of papers and a roll of cash. They discussed a quick way to fix things, a way to move the company into Colin's hands cleanly. Peter admitted he took the money. He'd been offered $50,000 up front and a promise of a cut of the company down the line. He'd stamped the document in the parking lot of a strip mall, not from his office, and he'd pretended I'd signed because it was easier than asking questions. He kept saying, "I know it was wrong. I know it was wrong," the words like a mantra. Reed didn't shout. He laid out the consequences in plain terms: confess, cooperate, and you'll get a lesser charge. He explained that telling the truth now would help him more than hiding the truth later. Peter wept, a short, wet sound. He signed a sworn statement in the presence of Reed and a desk sergeant. He agreed to testify, to describe exactly how Colin and Brittany had pressured him: the cash exchange, the parking lot stamping. It wasn't theatrical. There were no dramatic confessions with tears and redemption. It was quiet, thin, and precise. He had been greedy, and greed had a stupid way of making people sloppy. When he named the money amount and the promised percentage, my stomach turned, but Sam gave me one of those looks that said the right thing was finally happening. The cornerstone of their plan had been undermined. The forged will, the supposed last wishes they'd used as a shovel to bury me alive, was suddenly a rock tied to a confession. I walked out of that room in a slow, cold fog. Part of me wanted to scream. Part of me wanted to cry. Mostly, I felt the tight, terrible relief that comes when a long knot finally starts to loosen. They'd built their house on lies, and the thin old man above a laundromat had just handed us the first piece of proof that the house wasn't going to stand. Sam and Agent Reed moved fast once they had Peter Lang's statement. They started pulling everything they could find: bank receipts, credit card charges, security footage, the little digital crumbs people leave everywhere. I sat in Sam's office one afternoon while they ran through it, my fingers worrying the edge of a paper cup until it crumpled. The first thing that made my stomach drop was a simple gas station receipt. Colin had stopped to fill up the tank at 6:42 a.m. the morning after we camped. It wasn't near the park. It was 60 miles away. Someone had charged it on his card. It was a timestamp. A tiny number printed under the fuel total, plain and ordinary, except that it proved they weren't coming back at dawn like they'd told me in that lie about an emergency. They'd already driven away before the ridge hike ended. Then Reed's people got the trail camera footage from a local hiking club. They kept a camera on the main path for hikers, mostly to watch for maintenance issues and too often to capture someone doing something dumb on the trail. The footage they'd grabbed was grainy, gray morning light, but the image that stopped my breath was clear enough. At 5:15 a.m., under a dim, cold sky, my brother is loading gear into a car like someone who has all the time in the world. He's methodical, he's not panicked. Brittany's there, she's scrolling through her phone. They close the trunk, get in, and drive off. No running, no looking back, just an ordinary leave. The little square of video looped on a laptop screen felt like a betrayal in low resolution. Sam looked at me over the top of her glasses. "They left before you could have possibly been a danger to anyone," she said simply. "They left you to survive or die on your own. That timestamp kills their story." I stared at the images until my eyes watered. Seeing them driving away made the note on the table that morning feel like proof of intention instead of confusion. It made all the small, worried moments Mom and Dad had offered feel planned and staged. The digital trail was blunt and cold in its honesty. It didn't offer excuses. It just showed what happened when it happened and who did it. That was the kind of proof Sam said you couldn't argue with. When the investigators got a warrant for their phones, I felt like we were opening a window into the room where they'd plotted everything. The phone records weren't dramatic at first, lots of calls, lots of texts, but the pattern was ugly and steady. Colin's messages showed why he did it: debt, desperation, a string of payments and missed notices that added up to more than I wanted to know. He'd been drowning for months. My parents' phones had messages from Brittany that looked polite and patient, like she was coaching them through lines. "Just say she's been fragile," one read. "Mention the condo. It'll make it feel like a favor." It made my skin crawl to think of Mom and Dad being encouraged to trade their daughter's life for a promise of a nicer place to live. Brittany's phone was the worst. Her texts were meticulous, the criminal's notebook of a planner. She'd mapped out timelines, looked up insurance rules, and found Peter Lang. There was a string of drafts where she rehearsed how to present the story to the police, to friends, to vendors. One message she sent to Colin 2 nights before we left said, "Just remember, you have to be convincing. She has to believe this is for her own good. One weekend and all our problems are solved." It wasn't a stray sentence. It was a plan. Reading those messages felt like watching a spider unspool its web. Colin was the panicked fly caught in things he couldn't afford to fix on his own. Mom and Dad were not just foolish, they were complicit. And Brittany was the spider. She had built the web and baited the trap. The woman who'd toasted marshmallows and smiled in camp chairs had written the notes, the timelines, the calm scripts telling my family what to say. Knowing who planned it made my anger cleaner in a way. It wasn't a sad family misstep. It was cold, deliberate work, but having the proof didn't make life lighter. If anything, the mountain of paper and images meant the war was longer. Evidence had to be organized, witnesses had to be found, depositions scheduled. The legal part felt like a machine you had to feed with small, steady pieces, emails, receipts, signed statements, until the machine coughed up something useful. I ran on coffee and a thin, steady rage. I tried to keep Copperlark running, which now meant late-night calls and making decisions from a hospital fold-out chair while Sophie slept in the next bed. I tried to be present for her, to answer her small questions honestly without letting the anger slip into her world. People told me we had them on paper. They told me the evidence was crushing. What they didn't say was how much work it was to hold everything together while being eaten from the inside. Depositions took whole days. I sat across from people who looked like they hadn't slept, signing stacks of forms and repeating the same small story until it felt like a threadbare sweater rubbing my skin raw. Every time I thought we'd move forward, someone would file a new motion, or an investigator would call with another question, or a defense attorney would ask for more time. The legal calendar stretched like an elastic band that never snapped. One night, I was tucking Sophie in at home after a long day of meetings and interviews. The house smelled like the faint roast of coffee from my empty mug on the counter and the lemon cleaner I'd used to wipe the courtroom notes from the kitchen table. She'd been quiet all day, her small shoulders hunched like a question mark. When she turned to me and said, "Mommy, was it my fault that they left us?" The words landed like a weight. She was 10. She had somehow absorbed the betrayal and turned it inward, making herself responsible for the cruelty of adults. I held her until she stopped shaking and told her 1,000 times if she wanted that it wasn't her fault. I told her that people make bad choices and sometimes those choices hurt others, but that she had nothing to do with it. Her small hand in mine felt like a live wire. Her trust in me was the one thing I couldn't replace if it burned. After she fell asleep, I sat on the floor of her room and let the noise of the house settle, the tick of the baseboard heater, the occasional car passing outside, the soft hum of the refrigerator. I felt hollow in a way I hadn't expected. We had all the pieces of paper, we had camera images, we had confessions, but that didn't erase the nights I'd been too tired to sing, the days she'd seen me cry, the way she sometimes flinched at the sound of a car door. I thought about the future and what winning would cost us. Would it be enough to take them away? Would it fix the tiny hands that thought they were to blame? The fear that I'd win the court case but lose my daughter's sense of safety crowded into the room like a shadow. There was a morning I almost called Sam and told her to stop. I thought about taking the money and stepping out of public life, handing the company to someone competent, moving Sophie somewhere quiet, and pretending this had never happened. I imagined signing away the pain for a clean exit. The idea felt like a soft, dangerous siren. I wanted to be done. I wanted normal for my daughter more than anything. Then Megan showed up at my door with a cardboard box of warm donuts and 2 coffees, one in a paper sleeve with a lipstick smudge on the rim, my kind of messy, ordinary sign of life. Her hair was pulled into a quick bun and she didn't bother with small talk. She looked at me like someone who knew how close I'd come to the edge. "Don't you dare give up," she said, putting the box down on the kitchen counter. Her voice was rough with unsent emotion. "You came back, you fought. A lot of women at the shops put your picture on their desks, they're watching, you can't let them take that." She handed me a worn manila folder. When I opened it, a rush of bright, childish color spilled into the room, crayon drawings folded roughly, edges scribbled with a child's impatience. Megan gave me a small, embarrassed smile. "Sophie asked me to give these to you. She said they're for your work folder, she said they're pictures of after." I sat down at the kitchen table and smoothed the top drawing with my hand, feeling the grooves of crayon. There we were in Sophie's hand. 2 stick figures, a big one and a small one, under a sun with a crooked smile. There was a house with a washable roof and a garden full of purple blobs she'd labeled flowers. In shaky letters across the bottom, she had written, "We are okay." Something in my chest loosened. It wasn't a dramatic movie turn. It was a small, quiet tilt towards something I could hold onto. Megan told me about little things Sophie had said, how she liked to imagine our new yard, how she wanted a rose bush for Dad. Those simple things were not proof in court, but they were the proof I needed most. A map of the life we still might have. I folded the drawings carefully and slid them into my legal folder between depositions and bank slips. They were ridiculous and perfect there, a child's imagination wedged into piles of evidence. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than exhaustion and hate. It was fragile, like a sprout after a frost, but it was real. It told me why I was doing this beyond anger and retribution. We weren't fighting just to win a verdict. We were fighting for the messy, small things that make a life. The thought was enough to keep me going. The day of the conference room meeting felt like a weight I had to carry into a place that smelled like coffee and resolved paper. Monica Price had insisted everyone sit together once, face to face, to see what the record would show when we all shared the same space. She said it would be cleaner that way, less theater. I sat across from them, Colin, Brittany, Mom, and Dad, while Sam sat next to me and Monica beside her. Megan had flown in and took notes. The 4 people who had unloaded us into the woods looked smaller in that room, the way lies do when you set them across a table full of facts. They wouldn't look me in the eye. Colin stared at his hands, fingers picking at the cuticles like he was trying to hide fingerprints. Mom stared at the window, her face like something painted thin and pale. Dad kept clearing his throat. Brittany was the only one who looked at me. Her stare was a flat thing, like a camera lens that had stopped caring about what it saw. Their lawyer started with a prepared statement that sounded like it belonged in a movie. A tragic misunderstanding, a plan that got out of hand, phrases meant to make everything less sharp. Monica never raised her voice. She didn't need to, she did something better, she put down things. She placed the trail camera photo first, the one of Colin closing the trunk in dawn gray. Then the gas station receipt stamped with the time. Then Peter Lang's written statement, the notary who admitted the parking lot signing. She placed them in the middle of the table like pieces of clear glass. I reached into my folder and pulled out Sophie's drawings. My hand shook a little. I smoothed the top page and laid it on the wood where everyone could see. There we were in crayon, a big stick figure and a little stick figure under a sun that would never be quite round again but smiling nonetheless. Across the bottom in a child's shaky letters, "We are okay." The drawings did something to the room. They were not legal documents, they were not evidence in the strict sense, they were the whole point. They were proof of what I'd been fighting for, the small life someone had tried to take. Monica spoke slowly. At 5:15 a.m., this camera captured Mr. Whitfield and Miss Whitfield leaving the campsite, she said, sliding the glossy photograph a little closer to me as if to let me touch it. At 6:42 a.m., the gas station receipt shows a transaction in Mr. Whitfield's name 60 miles away. She glanced at their lawyer before she continued. And this notary, she placed Peter Lang's statement between the receipts and the photo, admits he took cash, stamped a forged signature, and lied about Mrs. Whitfield's presence. They tried to explain. Mom's voice wobbled into something like regret. Dad said it was panic. Colin's lips moved, but no words held against Monica's plain facts. Brittany's jaw worked. She blamed logistics and poor timing and an emergency that never existed. The sound of their excuses in that tight room was thin and cheap. It had no weight against the paper. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I told the truth plainly when Monica asked me to describe the morning, the hike, the ridge, the chipmunk, the note. I described Sophie's fever and the willow bark and the smoky H of our signal. I put the note on the table, the original, folded and slightly stained, and watched them register the cramped, familiar script. Colin's face went slack. Mom gasped like air had been pulled from her lungs. The meeting didn't end with drama, it ended with clear steps. Monica told them what was coming and what would hurt. The court would look at the paper trail, the witnesses would be called, and the story of a family who left their own to die would not hold a jury's sympathy. They left the room like people walking out of a life that had been stripped of its polish. I left with Sophie's drawings folded in my hand and a quiet that felt a little like a promise. The trial moved faster than I thought it would because the facts were solid and because Monica was relentless in the way she built the story. She didn't stand and sway with a tear-jerker speech. She laid out a line of simple things people could understand. They planned this, they left us, they tried to take our life and our company for money. She told the jury what the paper showed and what the video showed, and she put people on the stand who could speak to actions, not motives. Megan went first. She sat straight-backed and cool and explained, without flourish, the efforts Colin and Brittany had made to access vendor accounts, to change passwords, and to set up transfers. She had emails to show, requests that came from a hand that wasn't hers, from a role Colin had no right to play alone. Her testimony was practical, stripped of emotion but full of consequence. When she said, "I was asked to give them emergency access," you could hear the implication, the opening for theft, without needing a flourish. Then came Peter Lang. He shuffled to the stand in a way that made him look very small. He stammered at first, hands in his pockets, eyes tracing the courtroom like someone searching for an escape. But he told the truth. He told how Colin had met him with cash, how Brittany had promised a cut, how he'd stamped the document in his car because it was faster. His words were plain. He said, "I was paid to make it look real." The simple admission hit like a slap. The defense tried to make him look unreliable because of his greed, but greed is not a defense, it's motive. The trail camera photo was blown up during Monica's presentation until it filled the screen. There were muted gasps when the image of Colin loading the trunk at dawn came into sharp focus. You could hear people in the back shift in their seats. Then their lawyer tried to move their story, claiming they were distracted and panicked and that they'd left to save us. I answered calmly on the stand when it came to my turn. I told the jury what I remembered in small, clear pieces. The way the note felt in my pocket, the texture of Sophie's fevered skin against my cheek, the sound of rain in our little rock shelter. I didn't ask for pity. I offered facts and one human thing, that I had come back from near death to tell the truth. They tried to paint me as fragile. Their lawyer asked about sleepless nights, about missed meetings, about the shape of grief. I didn't hide that Mark had died. I didn't deny the nights I'd cried. I said plainly, I was grieving. Yes, grief doesn't make you incompetent. I told them about the survival lessons I'd learned out in the woods, how I rationed 2 protein bars and made willow bark into medicine for my daughter. When I spoke, I felt the room breathe with me. I could see people in the jury listening, not with drama, but with the simple attention of those who understand a parent will do anything for a child. The defense fought, of course. They called people who said my family had always been close, who tried to show a pattern of care. But the records were patient and cold. Money didn't care about their soft words. The notary's confession, the credit card timestamp, the trail footage, Brittany's messages, all of it was a steady drum. Monica built that drum into a rhythm the jury couldn't ignore. When the jury left to deliberate, the courthouse felt like a place caught between breaths. I went outside and felt the late winter air on my face and thought of the little H of rocks we'd built on that hill. I thought of Sophie drawing suns, telling me we were okay. I clung to that when the door to the courtroom opened and the jurors filed back in. They were out for less than 2 hours. The foreman stood, cleared his throat, and read each verdict like someone calling off a list. The courtroom felt huge and small at once. I remember Monica's hand tightening around mine. Sam's face was unreadable. Megan's eyes were wet. On the charge of attempted murder, he began, and the room held its breath. Guilty. The word landed like a stone. Colin's body folded in a way that made him look like a broken chair. Dad's jaw slackened. Mom's eyes squeezed shut. Brittany didn't move at all. She only stared at me as if expecting me to burn. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, guilty. On the charge of child endangerment, guilty. It unrolled like that, each guilty a knock. The jury found them guilty across the board on trying to take my life, on the plan to take our money, and on putting my child in danger. Their lawyer had no saving words left. The judge read sentences later, measured and firm. They each got time in real places you could visit on a map. It was not jubilation. It was a necessary closing of a door. Walking out of the courthouse after the verdict felt less like freedom and more like a long exhale I didn't know I was holding. People stopped us in the street. Some said brave things. News crews whispered questions that I refused to answer, but I had no appetite for spectacle. The courtroom had done what it needed to do. The law had placed consequences on actions that had almost taken my daughter and me away. After the trial, there was no big party, no dramatic press release. Sam arranged a quiet dinner in my kitchen. Monica and Megan came over. We didn't toast to revenge. We toasted to consequence, to the idea that choices have weight and that some lines, once crossed, change everything. The news covered the story like a train passing through town, bright headlines and brisk reports about a family betrayal. A few people called to offer support. I changed the locks on the house the next day because habits matter and because a new lock felt like a boundary I could control. I sold the condo Brittany had promised Mom and Dad and gave the money to the regional search and rescue group that had saved us. It was a small circle of repayment. I couldn't bring Mark back and I couldn't erase the nights in the woods, but I could do something useful with the money that had tried to buy our lives. I kept Copperlark Coffee, but I made changes. Megan became the chief operating officer and started taking on more of the day-to-day. I stepped back from the parts of the company that ate up nights and filled myself instead with small, important things. My calendar became about doctor visits and therapy sessions for Sophie, about school plays and weekend bike rides. I learned to answer calls less, to let the chain breathe on its own, and to show up where it mattered. The silence in my house changed. It was no longer the heavy, empty silence after Mark died. It was a softer silence punctuated by the small sounds of living, a kettle whistling, a page turning, Sophie practicing piano in the evening. The cost of victory was visible every day. Sophie flinched at loud noises and sometimes woke in the night, calling for me. She needed reassurance, and some nights I wasn't sure I had the right words. But her laughter started to return, small and real. The stick figures she drew were still a big one and a little one holding hands under a not perfect sun, but the faces were smiling more often. We moved to a small rental not far from the old house, a place with a backyard that had room for a single rose bush. The first weekend we were there, Sophie and I went to a nursery. She chose a red rose because she said it reminded her of Dad. We dug a hole together, our hands dirty and slow. There was comfort in soil under my fingernails, in the dull ache of muscle after a day of planting, in the ordinary work of making a place our own. At night, I sometimes think about Mom and Dad and Colin and Brittany in the quiet cells they now occupy. I wonder if they dream of the woods, of the struggle, of the note that said, "Trust me." Maybe they think on what they did in a way that matters. Maybe not. That thought is not mine to solve. My revenge was never a moment of shouting or a dramatic speech. It wasn't about watching them fall. It was about surviving and making sure their lies had consequences. It was about keeping Sophie safe and replanting a life with roots deep enough to hold us when storms come. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, share your story in the comments. Your voice matters. Please subscribe and stay for more stories of survival, truth, and the quiet kind of justice that comes from standing up and refusing to be erased.